Lake Erie is the shallowest of the Great Lakes, and because of that, its waters are the most unpredictable. On the surface, it looks beautiful, calm, almost inviting, but underneath lies a graveyard of forgotten ships, drowned sailors, and restless spirits. Locals whisper about ghostly lights that appear on the horizon, black fog that swallows the shoreline, and phantom ships that rise from the depths when the night is at its coldest. In today's episode, I'm sharing 3 true Lake Erie horror stories, terrifying encounters from those who stood too close to the edge and discovered that this lake does not forgive, and it does not forget. My name is Daniel Moore, and at the time this story took place, I was a 46-year-old man living a very ordinary and unremarkable life in northern Ohio, working long hours as a supply truck driver, driving across states with endless stretches of highway beneath me, a thermos of bitter coffee always at my side, and the faint hum of the radio to keep me awake during the late hours of the night. I had lived most of my life within only a few miles of Lake Erie, so the sight of its wide and restless waters had never been something I thought of as mysterious, though people around me often whispered about its unpredictable storms, its history of shipwrecks, and its strange disappearances that seemed to slip in and out of conversations like shadows. Growing up, I used to hear older fishermen talk about the sudden walls of fog that could trap boats for hours, and I knew people who swore they had seen strange shapes moving across the surface during moonless nights. But when you are a boy listening to adults talk about the world and half-truths, you file those things away as stories without real meaning, things said for effect, things that belong more to campfire tales than to daily life. By the summer of 2016, I had gone through what I can only describe as the hardest personal year of my life. My marriage of nearly 2 decades had ended in a bitter divorce that left me alone in a small apartment, half my belongings gone, my house sold, and a silence waiting for me every time I opened the door after a long haul. Work was the only part of life that still made sense, because the roads were predictable and the cargo never complained. When I was told I had a week off, an unusual stretch of free time that I had not experienced in years, I decided without much thought to drive out to Marblehead, Ohio, and rent a small wooden cabin by the lake, the kind of place that still smelled faintly of damp pine and old summers. My plan was simple: sit by the water, read some of the books I had been putting off, maybe write down some thoughts in my notebook, and let the quiet wash over me, hoping it might clean away the exhaustion that had settled into my bones. The cabin itself was plain and aged, with a sagging porch, a screen door that creaked when touched, and thin curtains that did little to block the sharp morning light. It stood only a short walk from the rocky shoreline, and I remember thinking that even if I did nothing else for a week, the sound of the water alone was worth the trip. The first night passed without event, only the familiar sounds of the lake moving against the rocks. But on the second night, as I walked slowly down the path that led toward the shore, I began to notice something that even now feels impossible to explain fully. The moon hung low, casting a thin silver light across the surface of the lake. But what caught my attention was not the reflection of the moon or the usual faint glow from the distant towns across the water. Instead, I saw small glimmers, faint and blue, like sparks that should have burned out, but instead drifted slowly across the surface. At first, I thought it must be boats far out on the lake, using unusual lights, though the way they moved, together in clusters, appearing and vanishing as though breathing, did not fit the way boats would normally shift across open water. I stood there for a long time, frozen by equal parts curiosity and unease, my breath slow and shallow as I tried to convince myself it was nothing unusual. As the minutes passed, I realized that the lights were not staying far away. They were moving, very slowly but undeniably, closer to the shore, as if drawn toward where I stood. They flickered in and out, disappearing for several seconds only to return closer. Their positions changed in strange, sharp patterns, not like natural reflections, but like something following a rhythm I could not hear. A weight settled in my stomach as I watched, because no matter how much I tried to tell myself it was an illusion of tired eyes, something deep inside me insisted that what I was seeing had form and purpose. When the first cluster reached the rocks near the shoreline, I could see them more clearly, and what unsettled me most was that the glow did not hover above the water like floating lanterns, but instead seemed to come from within the water itself, as though some unseen source beneath the surface was pushing out pale blue light. In the shifting glow, I thought I saw elongated shadows moving inside, forms that were almost, but not quite human, bending and swaying as if suspended. Before I could focus my eyes fully, the light would fade, leaving only black water, and each time it happened my heart beat harder, desperate to know and terrified at the same time. The following morning, I sat on the cabin porch drinking coffee that tasted bitter and metallic, trying to explain the sight to myself with logic. I thought about algae, about rare cases of bioluminescence that I had read about, though I knew such things were far more common in tropical seas than in the cold waters of Lake Erie. I even looked it up on my phone and saw that, while rare, some algae could glow faintly under certain conditions. That explanation calmed me for a short time, though deep down I knew it had not looked natural, had not moved in any way that science could easily explain. The third night, unable to shake the thought from my mind, I returned to the shoreline, telling myself that I only wanted to see it again and prove to myself it was something harmless. I brought with me a small flashlight and my phone, planning to record the phenomenon and maybe laugh at my overactive imagination. The night was colder, a thin mist curling low over the lake, and the world around me felt strangely hushed, as though holding its breath. Almost immediately, the lights appeared again, this time not far out but arranged in long, straight lines, as though forming a glowing path that stretched across the water. I lifted my phone to record, but the instant I pressed the button, the screen froze and then went black, the device shutting down without reason. I switched on my flashlight, but after only a second, it flickered weakly and died, leaving me surrounded by nothing but the pale blue lights that pulsed steadily from the lake. And then I felt it, not heard with my ears, but sensed through my body. A low, vibrating hum that seemed to rise from the water and spread through the rocks beneath my feet, shaking my legs and chest as though the lake itself was speaking in a language too deep to understand. The lights shifted again, forming what looked unmistakably like a path leading out into the water, each glow pulsing brighter in turn, as though guiding me step by step. I knew I should have turned away, should have run back to the cabin, locked the door, and left the next morning, but something stronger than reason pulled at me, an invisible tug that made my legs move forward almost against my will. The first shock of water around my ankles was so cold it felt like knives piercing my skin, but I kept moving, stepping into the lake with slow, heavy strides. Each time I moved forward, the hum grew deeper, resonating through my chest and skull until it drowned out every other thought. When the water reached my waist, I saw the lights ahead flicker violently, and within them, shapes began to form with dreadful clarity. Faces, pale and unmoving, eyes wide open, mouth slack, drifting beneath the surface. Some faces looked calm, almost peaceful, while others were twisted in silent terror, and every one of them stared directly at me as though waiting. At that moment, the fog lifted from my mind and panic returned in a flood. I stumbled backward, arms flailing, my foot slipping on a hidden stone, and I fell into the freezing water, choking as the taste of the lake filled my mouth. The lights surged forward in response, glowing brighter, the hum rising into something sharp and unbearable. But with every ounce of strength, I clawed and pushed my way toward the rocks, scraping my hands and knees as I pulled myself out of the water, gasping for air like a man who had nearly drowned. The lights hovered at the edge of the shore for a long time, pulsing steadily as though watching me. And then, one by one, they sank beneath the surface, disappearing into the black depths until the lake looked calm and ordinary once again. I did not sleep that night, sitting instead in the cabin with every lamp burning, my body still shaking. And when the first weak light of dawn touched the window, I packed my belongings into the truck and drove away, never looking back. To everyone who asked why I returned early, I said only that the lake air was colder than I expected, that the solitude felt heavier than I wanted, but the truth stayed locked in my chest like a weight that I have never been able to release. Years have passed, and still I dream of those lights. In my dreams, I do not turn back. I follow the glowing path deeper and deeper until I am surrounded by the cold silence of the lake, until the pale faces close in around me. And every time I wake with water in my mouth and the feeling that something from the depths has touched me, calling me back to finish what I escaped. I am Michael Harrington, and when I think back on the year 2008, I sometimes wonder if there was something written in fate that guided me toward Lake Erie that autumn, something heavy and dark that had been waiting for me long before I ever stepped near its waters, because I cannot shake the feeling that what happened during those days was not random or accidental, but rather the slow and inevitable turning of some ancient wheel that caught me, dragged me, and left me half alive in its aftermath. At the time, I was 38 years old, recently separated from my wife of 10 years, and in the middle of a quiet collapse that no one around me could see, because on the outside I was still employed, still polite, still functioning, but inside I was unraveling in long threads that left me waking up each morning with a weight in my chest and a growing conviction that life had lost its color. I worked as a surveyor for a small historical research company based in Cleveland, Ohio, a job that mostly involved examining old properties, documenting structures, and occasionally assisting in academic projects about the Great Lakes region, which, though often tedious, did at least keep me moving from place to place, giving me reasons to be out in the world when my natural instinct was increasingly to shut myself away. That October, my supervisor gave me an assignment that seemed straightforward at first glance. I was to join a small research initiative loosely affiliated with the university, focused on documenting sites of known shipwrecks along the southern coast of Lake Erie. The Great Lakes are notorious for the sheer number of vessels that have gone down over the centuries, from wooden schooners swallowed by sudden storms to steel freighters claimed by shifting ice. And although Lake Erie is the shallowest of the Great Lakes, it is among the most treacherous, a place where storms can rise out of nowhere and where fog can thicken so suddenly that sailors of the past often described it as if the lake itself was a living creature with moods that could turn deadly without warning. I had no special expertise in shipwrecks, but my role was logistical and observational, to assist in documenting shoreline markers, to coordinate with divers who would go into the water, and to compile environmental data. The center of operations for this particular project was a rented lakeside house near the town of Vermilion, Ohio, an old place with a wide porch facing the water and enough bedrooms to house 6 of us, 2 divers, 1 marine historian, 1 graduate student who seemed permanently exhausted, myself, and a coordinator who came and went depending on funding meetings. From the very beginning, the lake unsettled me. I had grown up near it, yes, but living beside it for weeks was different from seeing it occasionally from highways or docks. In October, Lake Erie was not the friendly summer backdrop of beach towns and fishing trips. It was steel gray, restless, and cold, with winds that cut through jackets and waves that seemed to strike the shore with a kind of anger. Standing on that porch during the first evening, looking out the horizon, I felt a pull I could not explain, as if the water stretched endlessly in both directions, not just across miles, but across time itself, holding within it the weight of every ship, every life, every scream swallowed by storms that left no survivors. Our assigned wreck lay about 3 miles offshore, marked on maps as a late 19th century freighter that had gone down during a sudden squall. Most records of it were vague, with survivor accounts contradicting one another, but it was said to have gone down quickly, the entire hull swallowed in minutes, leaving only fragments of cargo drifting to shore days later. The divers, both experienced and confident, treated it as routine work, something almost recreational, but from the start, I could not shake the sense that this was not simply another wreck resting quietly at the bottom, but something disturbed, restless, and waiting. During the first week, I stayed mostly on shore, recording notes, working with equipment, and filing daily reports. But each night, I found myself drawn to the porch after everyone else had gone to bed. I would stand there for hours, staring out across the black water, my body chilled by the wind, and on more than one occasion, I thought I saw something far out where the waves folded into one another. Not lights, not boats, but shapes, dark and broad, shifting as though something massive stirred beneath the surface. I told myself it was the mind playing tricks, the natural result of exhaustion and grief mixing with the monotony of staring at dark water. But each night the shapes returned, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, until eventually I began to dream of them. And in those dreams I saw not shapes but a ship, tall and broken, rising out of the depths with its mast snapping and its deck crowded with silent figures who stood motionless as if waiting for me to join them. The divers reported ordinary findings at first: broken planks, scattered cargo, fragments of machinery. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have disturbed me. And yet I noticed that each time they returned, their conversations grew shorter, their faces a little more pale, and their willingness to describe the wreck a little more reluctant, as if they were seeing things they preferred not to voice. The historian, a sharp woman in her 50s, noted in her journal that several similar wrecks in Lake Erie had long histories of sightings: fishermen who swore they heard voices on the water, families who spoke of ghost ships appearing in storms. But she wrote it with academic detachment, as though collecting folklore, while I read it with an unease that crawled beneath my skin. On the 12th night of the project, unable to sleep, I left the house and walked down the narrow path to the beach, carrying only a small lantern. The wind was strong enough to scatter sand against my boots, and the sound of the waves was louder than usual, rolling and crashing as if something heavy shifted just beyond reach. I stood there for a long time, staring into the dark, until I noticed that the horizon did not look right. It was not flat, not a clean division of sky and water, but instead broken by a shape that stretched wide, darker than the darkness around it. I held my breath, my eyes straining, and slowly, horribly, I realized I was looking at the outline of a ship, impossibly tall, with masts broken like shattered bones, and a deck that tilted unnaturally. It was there, undeniable, for long moments, and then, as a wave broke, it was gone, leaving only the endless black water. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and though I wanted to tell the others, I stayed silent, too afraid of the look they might give me, too afraid they might confirm that I had seen what I thought I had seen. That night I did not sleep at all, and when dawn came, I stared out at the calm gray lake and wondered if the wreck we sought was not resting peacefully beneath the water, but was instead still moving, still rising, still looking for something. The morning after I saw the ship's outline on the horizon, I moved through the rented house in a daze, every sound from the kitchen or hallway feeling muffled, as if I were walking underwater. And although the others seemed occupied with routine tasks, the divers checking their gear, the graduate student typing furiously on his laptop, the historian scribbling notes with the detachment of someone who had seen far stranger things in her career, I could not shake the feeling that everything inside those walls had already shifted, that whatever I had glimpsed on the lake had followed me back in some unseen form, pressing against the air and waiting to be noticed again. I told myself repeatedly that it must have been a mirage, a trick of the eyes caused by fatigue, shifting fog, and a restless imagination. But as the day went on, I began to see small signs that convinced me I was not alone in my unease. One of the divers, a man named David who usually carried himself with casual confidence, spent long stretches staring out the window toward the lake, his face pale and unreadable. And when I asked him offhand if the waters had been difficult the previous day, he replied only with a faint shrug and avoided meeting my eyes, as if words themselves were too heavy to carry. Later that afternoon, when both divers returned from their scheduled descent, I noticed something that unsettled me far more than any vague silence. Their gear, which had always been neatly arranged and carefully maintained, was coated in a thin layer of black residue. Not mud or algae, but something sticky and tar-like, clinging stubbornly to their suits and masks. They scraped it off without explanation, working silently on the porch, but when I stepped closer to examine it, the smell hit me with such force that I gagged. It was not the smell of oil or natural decay, but something far worse, a mixture of rot and salt and a sweetness so unnatural that it turned my stomach. And though I asked them what it was, they gave me no clear answer, only muttered something about sediment before walking away. That night, lying awake in the narrow bed of the lakeside house, I heard something that froze me in place, a low sound rising from outside, not the natural crash of waves, but a rhythm, slow and deliberate, as if something massive were dragging itself along the bottom of the lake. I tried to convince myself it was only the wind moving across the water, but as I listened, the sound became more distinct, a creaking like old wood straining under weight, followed by the faintest metallic groan, as if rusted iron were shifting after decades of rest. I lay there motionless, every nerve alive with fear, until eventually the sound faded, leaving only silence. But I did not sleep a single moment that night. The following day, I attempted to distract myself with routine work, recording shoreline data and cataloging notes. But the historian called me over during the late afternoon with an expression that made my chest tighten. She had been reviewing survivor testimonies of various wrecks across Lake Erie and had come across one fragmentary report from the very freighter we were investigating. In it, a surviving deckhand claimed that in the final minutes of the storm, just before the ship went down, he had seen something rise from the water beside the hull. Not another vessel, not debris, but something massive and shapeless that struck the ship with enough force to snap its masts. The testimony had been dismissed as the ramblings of a traumatized man, but reading it now, in the shadow of what I had seen and heard, it felt less like madness and more like a warning that had never been heeded. By the end of the second week, both divers began refusing to enter the water for more than a few minutes at a time. They offered vague excuses about equipment malfunction, about currents pulling too strongly, but I noticed the way their hands trembled when they handled their masks, the way their eyes darted to the horizon as if expecting something to break through. One evening, as I stood on the porch with David, he finally muttered in a low voice that he thought he had seen bodies down there, not skeletons or scattered remains, but intact bodies drifting upright, their clothes fluttering as if they were still alive, their faces pale and bloated with water. And when I asked him what he meant, he shook his head violently and told me to forget it. That night I returned again to the beach, driven by an impulse I could not explain. And as I stood with the lantern in hand, staring into the endless black water, I felt a pressure in my ears, as though I had descended too deep beneath the surface. Though I was standing in the open air, the lake was calm, unnaturally calm, its surface almost glass-like. And in that stillness I saw the first ripple break across it, not caused by wind or fish, but by something rising from below. The shape was immense, so broad it seemed to stretch across half the horizon, and as it grew, I felt my chest tighten with the realization that I was not looking at a shipwreck lying silently on the bottom, but at a ship that was moving, rising, dragging itself upward with impossible force. The outline became clearer, and though the night air was bitterly cold, I felt heat wash across my skin, a feverish warmth that made me lightheaded. I could see the broken masts jetting out at impossible angles, the torn deck tilted as though caught mid-scream, and worst of all, I could see figures standing upon it. They were not shadows or illusions, but people, dozens of them, unmoving, their heads turned toward me in perfect unison, their eyes glinting with a pale light that seemed neither alive nor dead. The lantern slipped from my hand, the flame hissing out in the sand, but I could not move, my body locked in place by a terror so deep it felt like my bones were freezing. The ship hovered there for long moments, silent, massive, wrong in every possible way, and then, without sound, it sank back beneath the surface, vanishing into the depths with unnatural speed, leaving the lake black and calm once again. When I returned to the house, shaking uncontrollably, I found that the air inside smelled faintly of the same tar-like sweetness I had noticed on the diver suits, and in the hallway, I thought I heard faint dripping, as though water was seeping invisibly through the walls. I did not tell the others what I had seen, not that night, not the next day, not ever, because even as fear consumed me, a darker truth was settling in. I had the terrible sense that speaking it aloud would make it real in ways I was not ready to face, that naming the ship would call it closer, that giving shape to the horror would give it permission to reach further into the world of the living. The days that followed blurred into one another, a cycle of gray skies, restless water, and sleepless nights filled with sounds I could not explain. Distant groans of wood, faint echoes of voices carried on the wind, sudden splashes near the shore with no visible cause. The others grew quieter, their work half-hearted, their eyes shadowed, and though no one spoke openly of it, I knew we were all feeling the same thing, that we had awakened something that was never meant to rise again, something drowned but not dead, something that had been waiting for us all along. The final week of that October bled into itself in a way I can hardly describe, because every day began with the same gray light filtering through thin curtains. Every hour seemed filled with the same restless motion of wind across the water, and every night ended in the same suffocating silence, a silence that was never truly empty, but instead carried faint echoes of things I could not fully hear. By then, the others in the house had stopped pretending that everything was ordinary. The graduate student rarely left his room, his notes scattered in a chaotic sprawl across the floor, while the historian sat for hours at the dining table with books and journals spread before her, though I often noticed her staring blankly into the distance, her pen unmoving, as if the act of documenting had lost all meaning. The divers argued quietly in the kitchen, their voices sharp and tense, and I could sense that their nerves were unraveling in ways not unlike my own, though each of us seemed determined not to give voice to the true cause of our fear. It was on the 22nd day that David, the more outspoken of the two divers, announced that he would not return to the wreck. His voice cracked as he said it, his hands clenched so tightly that the skin whitened around his knuckles, and though the coordinator tried to reason with him, reminding him of contracts and obligations, there was no force strong enough to send him back beneath the water. He did not offer a clear explanation, only muttered that he had seen too much, that the lake was wrong, and then he left, packing his belongings into his truck and driving away without another word. His absence left the house even heavier, as though the walls themselves had grown closer together, and the silence of the remaining group felt suffocating. The second diver, a quieter man named Ellis, lasted only 2 days longer. On the morning of the 24th day, he suited up without speaking to anyone, carried his gear down to the small boat moored by the dock, and set out toward the wreck site. Hours passed, then most of the afternoon, and when the sun dipped low behind thick clouds, the boat drifted back to shore without him, empty, rocking gently as though guided by unseen hands. We searched along the beach, called out across the water, but there was no trace of him. The historian, pale and trembling, whispered that perhaps he had chosen not to return, but I knew the truth even then. Ellis had not left by choice. Something in the lake had claimed him, and now his body drifted among the drowned. That night, I sat alone on the porch, the cold air biting into my skin, and watched as the horizon seemed to shift again. The water was still, unnaturally so, as though the entire lake were holding its breath, and then slowly, the shape of the ship began to rise once more. But this time it did not remain distant. It moved closer, impossibly close, until I could see the details with sickening clarity. The hull split open like a wound, the deck warped and twisted, the masts broken and pointing skyward like blackened fingers. And upon that deck stood figures, not dozens but hundreds, silent and unmoving, their eyes fixed on me with a gaze so heavy that I felt my chest compress, as though pressed by unseen hands. I wanted to run, but my body betrayed me. I stood frozen, my feet rooted to the porch, my breath shallow and ragged, and as I stared into those faces, I began to recognize them. Some looked like old photographs I had seen in historical archives, sailors dressed in uniforms from another century, but others looked shockingly recent, their clothing modern, their features unblurred by time, and among them I saw Ellis, his face pale and bloated, his eyes wide open, staring at me with the same unblinking intensity as the rest. My stomach lurched while rising in my throat, but still I could not move. The ship creaked, a sound so loud it seemed to echo inside my skull, and then slowly, the figures began to raise their hands in perfect unison. They did not wave, they did not beckon, but the motion carried a weight that felt like command. My legs moved forward against my will, carrying me down the steps of the porch, across the sand, and into the icy water. The shock of cold should have broken the spell, but instead it seemed to deepen it, each step sinking me further into a trance that drowned out every rational thought. The water reached my knees, then my waist, then my chest, and all the while the figures stood unmoving, their hands raised, their eyes fixed. When the water reached my chin, I felt something brush against my leg. It was not the smooth drag of a wave or the shifting pull of current, but something solid, something shaped like a hand. I gasped, inhaling lake water that burned down my throat, and in that choking panic, the spell cracked just enough for me to flail backward. I stumbled, my arms thrashing, and somehow managed to drag myself onto the sand, coughing and retching as my lungs fought for air. When I lifted my head, the ship was already sinking back into the depths, vanishing with unnatural speed, leaving only ripples that smoothed into silence within moments. I crawled back to the house, every muscle trembling, my body drenched and freezing. Inside, the historian sat rigid at the table, her eyes wide and glassy, her pen lying broken beside her notebook. She looked at me but said nothing, and in that silence I realized she too had seen it, perhaps even more clearly than I had. Neither of us spoke the truth aloud, and in the days that followed, she left quietly, her belongings gone one morning, as if she had vanished into the air. I never saw her again. I remained in the house for 2 more nights, unable to summon the strength to leave. My mind fractured between terror and obsession. I could not stop replaying the image of the ship, the faces, the raised hands, and most of all Ellis staring back at me with that lifeless gaze. On the 3rd morning, I packed my things and drove away without looking back, though I carried with me the certainty that the lake was not finished with me. It has been many years since those weeks in Vermilion, yet the memory has not softened with time. I dream of the ship often, dreams in which I stand again on the porch as the water stills and the horizon darkens, dreams in which I walk willingly into the lake and feel those pale hands pulling me downward. I wake each time with the taste of brine in my mouth and the sensation of weight pressing on my chest, as though something unseen has followed me into waking life. And though I live now hundreds of miles from Lake Erie, I sometimes catch the faintest smell of that tar-like sweetness in the air, a smell that freezes me in place, a smell that tells me the drowned ship has not forgotten me, that it waits still in the depths, carrying its silent crew, and that one day, whether in dream or in reality, I will join them on that warped deck, standing motionless among the others, staring forever at the shore I should never have approached. The memory I am about to share has stayed with me for over a decade like a stain that never fades, a memory so heavy and sharp that I cannot speak of it without feeling my heart tighten in my chest. And even now, after years have passed, I sometimes wake at night convinced that I am back in that fog, choking on the cold air, waiting for those shapes to emerge again from the shifting darkness. My name is Rachel Turner, and in the autumn of 2012, I was 27 years old, working as a traveling nurse, moving from city to city, wherever hospitals had shortages, and for 6 weeks I was assigned to a small hospital in Sandusky, Ohio, a town perched on the edge of Lake Erie. I had been there once as a child during a family trip to Cedar Point, and my memories of that time were bright rides, laughter, and the endless blue horizon of the lake. But as an adult, coming back alone in the dead of autumn, I found that the lake had a different character, one that unsettled me from the very first day. I rented a guest house just 2 blocks from the shoreline, a small 2-story structure with creaking floors and thin walls that carried every gust of wind. My days were spent inside the hospital under fluorescent lights and endless alarms, caring for patients in recovery wards and emergency units, my body pushed to exhaustion. But every evening I walked to the lake. It was a habit I could not resist, because even though the water unsettled me, it also gave me space to breathe, a silence to let the weight of the day lift from my shoulders. Yet the silence was never quite right. There was always something beneath it, a strange heaviness, like the world was holding its breath whenever I stood by the shore. By late October, the town grew emptier. The tourist season was gone, the amusement park shut down, the boats pulled from the marina, and the lake turned darker each evening, restless and sharp with the coming of winter. Some nights I saw fog rolling across the horizon, sudden and unnatural, swallowing boats and lights, and though locals at the diner laughed when I asked about it, saying fog was common on the lake, I could tell from their expressions that there was more they were not saying. The night it happened was October 29th, 2 days before Halloween, and I had just finished an overnight shift. My body ached, my mind felt raw, and I thought a walk would steady me before collapsing into bed. I wore a heavy jacket, stuffed my hands deep into the pockets, and headed down toward the breakwater near the marina. The wind carried a cold bite, rattling dry leaves across the ground, and the lake looked violent, its surface churning with broken patterns that reflected no light. The sky sagged low with bruised clouds, and I felt that uneasy pressure again, the kind that makes you feel watched even when alone. At first, I thought I saw smoke, a dark ribbon stretched across the horizon, too sharp to be a natural cloud. It rose slowly, folding into itself, until I realized it was fog, though unlike any fog I had ever seen. It moved in a solid wall, rolling forward fast, swallowing the water, the breakwater, the distant lights of town. Within minutes, I stood in darkness so thick I could not see my own hands, and the air grew icy, colder than anything I had ever felt in October. The smell that filled the fog was unbearable, not damp or earthy like normal fog, but heavy with decay, like rotting vegetation mixed with the sharp tang of rusted iron. It clung to the back of my throat, making me gag. But worse than the smell was the silence. Fog normally muffles sound, but this was more than silence. It was emptiness, a vacuum that pressed against my ears. And then the silence broke. I began to hear them, soft, dragging steps, uneven and wet, circling me in the dark. At first, I told myself it was only the shifting of the waves, but the rhythm was too exact, too deliberate, and soon there were dozens of them, shuffling in an endless circle. My chest tightened as fear surged through me, and though every instinct screamed to run, my feet stayed planted, frozen by a dread so deep I could hardly breathe. Shapes began to emerge, faint shadows flickering in the shifting fog. I blinked, certain my tired eyes were betraying me, but the figures grew clearer, taller, closer. They looked like people, but their bodies were wrong. Their heads tilted unnaturally, their arms hanging stiff and broken, their legs bending at angles no living body could walk. Their faces were pale blurs, but I could feel their eyes on me, hollow and endless, watching with a hunger that made my skin crawl. I tried to retreat, turning back toward the path, but the fog had swallowed it whole. Every direction looked the same, and when I stumbled forward blindly, the figures shifted to block me, always appearing ahead, no matter where I turned. My breath came in sharp gasps, the cold air slicing my throat, and panic drove me toward the water, thinking the shoreline would guide me back. But the fog bent distance in unnatural ways. Each step seemed to take me deeper into an unfamiliar place, where the sand gave way to sharp rocks, and the lake no longer sounded like waves, but like whispers rising from beneath the surface. At one point, I tripped over something hard. My hands fell against splintered wood, slick with moisture. I felt along it in desperation, and realized it was a fragment of a boat, though old and rotted, half buried in the sand. As I looked up, the fog thinned for a moment, and I saw it, a full mast rising into the air, though it was not anchored to the earth. It floated above me, vanishing into the fog, the remains of a wreck suspended in the dark. Around it, dozens of the broken figures gathered, their hollow faces turned toward me, their bodies swaying as though pulled by unseen water. I remember falling to my knees, choking on fear, trying to scream, but the fog devoured all sound. The figures closed in, their shuffling louder, their pale arms stretching toward me, and in that moment the ground seemed to dissolve. I fell into nothing, a drop so deep and endless that it felt like sinking into the bottom of the lake itself. Black water filled my mouth, sharp and metallic, pressing into my chest until I could not breathe. My vision blurred, and just before I lost consciousness, I saw one of the figures close enough to touch, its face inches from mine. Its skin was slick with lake weed, its jaw unhinged, and its eyes were two pits of black fog that seemed to pull me inside. When I woke, I was lying on the rocks near the breakwater, my body soaked to the bone, my jacket torn, my hair tangled with weeds. The fog was gone, the lake calm, and the marina lights flickered weakly in the distance. My watch said only an hour had passed, but I felt as if I had been lost for days. My hands and arms were bruised, my throat raw as if I had been screaming, though no one had heard me. I left Sandusky days later, breaking my contract early, unable to sleep in that town another night. No one believed my story. They laughed kindly, told me I was overtired. That fog on Lake Erie could play tricks on the mind. But I know what I saw, and I know it was real. Even now, years later, when the air grows damp and the night grows cold, I sometimes wake to the smell of that metallic rot, and in the corner of my room I hear them. The dragging footsteps, slow and wet, circling closer, waiting for the moment when the black fog will roll in again, no matter how far I have run from the lake. If you thought these stories were terrifying, remember, Lake Erie keeps its secrets well, and the horrors beneath its waves are never truly gone. Stay away from the shoreline after dark, because you never know what might be watching. We'll meet again. Until then, take care.